Hey historians, it's time to look at the explosive bits. That's right, let's look at the early conflicts in American history, and I bet you don't know them all. Let's take a look. In 1845, the United States decided that Texas, the Republic of Texas, could join the United States as a state. This actually really was not okay with Mexico. You guys might remember in 1836, Texas has won its independence from Mexico at the Battle of San Jacinto. The leader of the Mexican forces, Santa Anna, who had been the dictator at the time, had signed a treaty. But that treaty, Santa Anna was like, no, I signed that. Mexico didn't sign that. So Mexico still kind of thought Texas was theirs. And in fact, from 1836 all the way through 1846, for that 10 years, the Mexican government never really acknowledged that Texas was its own country. And in fact, there were going to be some battles and even an invasion of Texas by Mexican forces that we rarely talk about in American history. All of that means when the United States annexes Texas, we annex the problems of Texas, and that includes a problem with Mexico. Mexico thinks the border with Texas ends at the Nueces River, which is near Corpus Christi, Texas. The United States says that Texas ends at the Rio Grande, pretty much where it does now. So we have a boundary dispute. The United States sends an army under a general named Zachary Taylor down into South Texas to basically say, hey, this is where Texas ends, this is where Mexico begins. We're putting an army here just in case you guys get ornery about it. Well, surprise, surprise, they do get ornery about it. Zachary Taylor winds up fighting a battle at a place called Palo Alto, and then fighting a series of battles in the north of Mexico, all victories driving the Mexican forces back into northern Mexico. Meanwhile, President Polk decides that Zachary Taylor, who is a little too popular for the president's liking and has said he might run for president himself, President Polk decides that Zachary Taylor is maybe getting too popular and he doesn't want to hand General Taylor even more victories to make him even more popular. So he decides that this Mexican war is going to have another front. He provides an army to a general called Winfield Scott, a hero of the War of 1812, and he says, invade Mexico from the sea. And Winfield Scott does just that. He lands at a place called Veracruz and he drives towards Mexico City. On that drive, a lot of the soldiers who are going to show up again as generals in the American Civil War really start showing that, hey, these are quality guys. I'm talking about guys like Robert E. Lee. I'm talking about Thomas Jackson. I'm talking about Ulysses S. Grant. They are all heroes of the Mexican War. The Mexican War ended in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. That Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo provides for the Mexican Cession, which is basically this idea that, hey, Mexico owned all this land in New Mexico, Arizona, California. Now it's part of the United States. The United States got a ton of land as a result of winning this war. Of course, the most important conflict in early American history is the time we fight each other. The American Civil War from 1861 to 1865 is fought over the idea of sectionalism. Sectionalism is this idea that the part of the country where you live is more important than any other part, and that the people in your part of the country are not bound by the same laws and same decisions that bind others. This is all wrapped up in the idea of slavery and the idea of states' rights, but what can't be denied is that this war is going to be the most devastating America will ever fight. It begins in April of 1861 in Charleston, South Carolina. South Carolina has seceded from the Union, but Union forces are still in the state, primarily in federally held forts. One of those forts is in Charleston Harbor. It's called Fort Sumter. It's a brand new fort in 1861. In April, Southern troops open fire on that fort, and the hostilities between North and South have begun. Let's talk about how the Civil War is going to be fought. The Civil War is going to be fought the Napoleonic way. I'm sure you've seen movies of this. People fighting in lines, shoulder to shoulder, marching within 20 or 30 yards of the enemy, and opening fire in volleys. That is going to cause amazing amounts of carnage in the Civil War, primarily because this has changed. It might look like the same gun that is used in the American Revolution. It might look like that same gun, but it's not. And the difference is right here in the barrel. The inside of the barrel is rifled. It means that there are grooves in the barrel. Primarily, beforehand, you had a bullet, which was a ball, and you dropped it into basically a cylinder. When the ball was fired, it rattled around in that cylinder, and as soon as it got out of the barrel, it could fly anywhere. After about 20 or 30 yards, you couldn't really tell where that bullet was going, which is why when armies fought, they fought in the Napoleonic way, shoulder to shoulder. If you got a bunch of bullets going in the same direction, you had a better chance of those bullets hitting something. Now, the rifled barrel changes things. The grooves on the inside of that barrel take the bullet and spin it, just like a football, in a tight spiral. So when it leaves the barrel, it's not rattling around anymore. It's spinning. It's heading straight. Now it can hit what it aims at, and it can hit it about 400 yards away. This has changed, but the way of fighting has not. In fact, for the majority of the American Civil War, both armies will fight in the Napoleonic way, shoulder to shoulder. But the weapons have changed, they've become more deadly, and the casualties will mount up and mount up and mount up. Something else has changed. Also technology. Railroads. Railroads crisscross the country now. They can move troops quickly from north to south, from east to west. And the section of the country that has the most railroads is going to have the advantage in moving troops and supplies. That's, of course, going to be the north. They have more railroad. They have more industry. They can make up for their losses in supplies incredibly quickly and move those supplies faster than the Confederacy can. The Confederacy is sometimes has to use wagon trains or mule trains to move supplies, while the North is moving supplies through railroads. Also, the North is using the telegraph wire to instantly communicate back and forth and to arrange the movement of armies. The South primarily doesn't have the telegraph. Realizing that the South is going to be at a disadvantage at the very beginning of the war, General Winfield Scott, and you're like, wait, I know that name. Yeah? It's the same general that led the forces during the Mexican War. Here he is, 20 years later. He's old, he's near retirement, but he has an idea. He calls it Scott's Anaconda, like the big snake. I hate big snakes. But his idea is the South doesn't have industry, the South doesn't have supplies. Let's cut the South off. Let's blockade the South. Let's let nothing into the South, and we'll slowly squeeze the South to death. So obviously, in the beginning of the war, the North has this huge industrial advantage, but the South has an advantage of its own. The South's primary advantage in the early years of the war lies in its leadership ability. Most of the senior officers of the United States Army, when secession happens across the South, actually come from the South. Those officers resign their commissions in the United States Army and go to fight for the South. So there's a huge leadership deficit in the United States Army, which the United States Army doesn't help things by appointing its senior leadership during the Civil War primarily with volunteer generals who are mostly politicians. They don't have any experience, they squabble, they argue amongst themselves, and primarily, they lose. That's pretty much what the Union Army will do for the first 2 years of the war. They're going to be ineptly led, and they're going to lose. The leadership in the South is much, much higher quality, and it begins and ends with Robert Edward Lee. He was such a quality soldier that when the war began, Abraham Lincoln actually asks Robert Lee to serve as the commanding general of the United States Army. Lee turns him down because he cannot draw his sword against his home state of Virginia. That idea of sectionalism really running deep in Americans at this point. Robert E. Lee is going to be the primary military leader of the South throughout the war. He is the one who is going to fight off the northern invasions of the South, and he himself is going to invade the North, not once but twice. Neither of those invasions work out very well. The first time it's because of luck. At a battle called Antietam, September 17th, 1862, Unfortunately for Robert E. Lee, the plans for this invasion have been lost. They've been dropped by a courier, and those plans are found by the North. The North finds a plan, they rush to confront Lee, and you get one of the bloodiest days in American history, and the bloodiest day of the war. It's usually regarded as a draw. Robert E. Lee stops his invasion, goes back into the South. But primarily what it does is it convinces Abraham Lincoln that he needs to issue the Emancipation Proclamation that will free the slaves in the South. It's enough of a victory for the North that Lincoln feels that the Emancipation Proclamation will be seen not as a desperate measure, but as a moral measure. Now, since Antietam, Lee will fight a series of victories against inept Northern leadership. He will fight the North at places like Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville and Bull Run, and he will beat them time and time and time again. And then he invades the North one more time. The battle that results in July of 1863 is called the Battle of Gettysburg. Lee doesn't even want to fight there. It's just where all the roads happen to converge in Pennsylvania. It's starting to bring his army together. He's hoping to menace Washington, D.C. Instead, the Union Army meets him. They fight for 3 days. The battle ends with a mistake on General Lee's part. He sends his men across over a mile of open field, going uphill into an entrenched Union position. It's called Pickett's Charge. In his mind, he sees these men breaking through the Union line and winning the war. In reality, the technology of war has changed so much that sending men over a mile of open field, shoulder to shoulder, within range of cannon and rifles, is just pure suicide. The Battle of Gettysburg is usually regarded as the battle that just breaks the back of the Confederacy. Up until this point, the Confederacy could sustain losses. After the Battle of Gettysburg, it doesn't matter if the Confederacy wins a battle or not. The North can replace troop losses, the South cannot. So even victories become a tiny, tiny defeat. At about the same time the odds against the Confederacy get worse with the loss at Gettysburg, they also suffer a loss at a place called Vicksburg. The fall of Vicksburg cuts the Confederacy in half. The armies of Ulysses S. Grant had been working their way down the Mississippi, taking port after port after port. And the idea is to rend the South in half. Just break it into 2 pieces, east and west. Make them unable to supply each other. And Vicksburg is the last port on the Mississippi. It completes this breaking in half. And Abraham Lincoln knows he's found a general that can actually compete with Robert E. Lee. He's going to bring Ulysses S. Grant to the east. He's going to give him command of all the Union forces. Ulysses S. Grant is going to start pounding Lee's Army of Northern Virginia over and over and over again, taking heavy losses. But unlike the other Union generals, he just won't give up. He just keeps coming back. He will not quit. He will not give Lee a break. By 1865, that is starting to tell. At a place called Appomattox Courthouse in April of 1865, Robert E. Lee surrenders to Ulysses S. Grant. And although there are other Confederate armies in the field, they will surrender within the next couple of months. The war is basically over when Lee surrenders to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. Of course, the sad aftermath is within 2 days, Abraham Lincoln himself will be dead, shot by a Southern sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth. Ironically, John Wilkes Booth is trying to re-energize the South, but by killing Lincoln, he's actually killed the one man in a position of power who was looking to let the South up easy after this war. By killing Lincoln, what he has guaranteed is Reconstruction, and a violent, hostile Reconstruction that will scar the nation for the next century. And that is a quick look at the conflicts in early American history. Did any of it surprise you? If there's no questions, comments, or screams of thanks, I will see you next time.